Hello. John Olsen, one of Australia's great artists, was celebrated at a state funeral today. His paintings hang in galleries all around Australia. He was not only a very talented man, he was also very charming, intoxicating even. But like many artists, his work always came first. It's a truth his families had to contend with and that they still carry, even amidst their love and gratitude for a life well lived.
The Opera House is by far the greatest blank canvas on earth. The Vivid Light Festival is an incredible thing. Multimedia is really a young people's art form, and to think they've ultimately incorporated a 95-year-old artist into a kind of wonderful melding of images, a mini retrospective shown in 10 minutes with the animals and the creatures that incorporate themselves into his work becoming alive.
Here come the frogs.
We were there to watch him in the studio create some of these paintings over the years.
Remember that one being in the studio?
Yes.
Yeah.
This was planned well before his death, and he was just so over the moon about this idea.
If they didn't get his work before, they'll get it now.
Oh, yeah.
The ferry's passing by him. He would have just been blown away.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful way to say goodbye, even though he didn't know it was actually saying goodbye at the time.
I've got all sorts of little details.
Dad painted the mural inside the Sydney Opera House, and for that painting to be projected on the outside of the Opera House is a wonderful full circle.
And there's that reflection of the colour in the water, which he was always talking about.
Yes.
Before he passed away, I was able to show him a little mock-up or an animation of what the Opera House was going to look like. And he was so moved to see what they were able to create with his work. There was actually a little tear that ran down his face, even though he was unable to speak. But it was really like, that's my final statement.
Oh, so it's too red.
Yeah, too red.
Mix it with burnt sienna. It's that tone there, see that?
Yeah, okay.
John Olsen is one of the great survivors of Australian art. He's in the top of the pantheon of our greatest painters.
The thing is that it's an overview of the landscape as though we're flying over the top of it, and this dark thing here is a road.
Art is a river that's run through our family and definitely sort of fed us and looked after us. And it runs in our veins.
It's something like writing the landscape. I'm an artist, as a dog is a dog. I didn't choose my profession. It chose me.
My next guest tonight has risen to become one of Australia's leading painters. Ladies and gentlemen, John Olsen.
Everything in his life was at the convenience of his genius, for his genius to be protected, and he was ruthless about that. And he would walk away from a relationship if it meant to preserve better his genius.
Parents can cast a shadow of great light. It's kind of a paradox in a way. Even though he cast great light, for me it became a shadow, that I would never be as interesting as him.
Yes.
John,
Good morning.
Lisa, this lovely to have you. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's good.
Tim as well.
Hi, Lisa. Yeah, nice to see you.
Good to see you. Awesome. We're so excited to have you.
I saw how Dad was loved so much. I wanted to be loved as much as him.
Tim put so much emphasis on the greatness of his father and made his father big, and I think as a consequence, perhaps he made himself small.
My father was never given a handbook on how to be a father because his own father didn't have one either.
John was born in Newcastle in 1928. It was an uncultured childhood. There were no books, no music.
Dad had a tough childhood at times with a father who was absent, who also suffered terribly from the war and fell into alcoholism.
I began as an artist at age 4, and my mother complaining about me scribbling in her cooking books.
I remember him telling me stories about when he was at school and all he could think about was drawing.
It was a calling. In his puberty and skyrocketing testosterone, he became known as being the best drawer of women's breasts.
I thought, I'd like to learn to draw properly, and then I went to Julian Ashton's and I met all the people that had been waiting for me. It was just a marvellous thing.
The nude I was particularly outstanding in.
And it lit a fire in him, and he knew that this was what he was going to become. He was going to become an artist. John got a private scholarship in 1957 and he finished up in Spain. He worked out how to get that culture that was missing from his childhood.
When you go abroad, you think more sort of poignantly about where you come from.
Now, Olsen had come back to give us the Word, and this one was the Word made flesh.
One of John's great masterpieces, painted not long after he returned from Europe, was the Spanish Encounter, which is in the Art Gallery of New South Wales.
Spanish Encounter shocked Sydney with its boldness and childlike abandon.
Dad started teaching at East Sydney Tech, and that's where he met Mum. Mum was one of the students at the college.
My mother just was absolutely smitten by his style and his mind, his verbal capacity, his understanding of art. He was international, he was worldly.
I let lines and colours move around and sort of splotch and dab.
He was a maverick, a debonair maverick.
I want my paintings to have lots of things in them. I don't care if they've got any sort of logical relationship to each other.
Mum was legless. She just fell so deeply in love with this man who was, you know, perpetually fascinating. Louise and I were so lucky to grow up in Watsons Bay, which in those days in the 60s was still very much like a fishing village. To be able to be like a free-range child running around Camp Cove, climbing the rocks, fishing, swimming all summer, and it was so romantic in a way.
I plan to paint for a long time. I think it's our responsibility to take reasonable care of our bodies, particularly when one is on the grog 30 days and 30 nights.
My mum, Valerie, just loved and adored my dad, and she was very happy in many ways for him to shine.
My mother dedicated her life to bringing Louise and I up and also keeping Dad's environment right for him to paint. She wasn't interested in money or anything material, and she was a great painter.
To see your father so happy and excited in the studio, and my mum too, to see the joy and sensitivity that was going on in her studio was so inspiring and so intoxicating.
The house was a place of art, conversations, and so they were brought up in this atmosphere in which that art counted, it was alive.
He is known as a landscape painter, but, you know, the landscape is everywhere. It can be on a table, it can be in a vase, it can be in a face. Everything is a landscape in so many ways. In the early 70s, Dad dragged us off to Dunmurchan, and we lived in an artist colony with Clifton Pugh.
How's it going there, Nettie?
It's absolutely crazy in Sydney at the present moment. And I found that the pressures were just too much for me to work.
We really did follow his creative journey, which was great in so many ways. We loved being on that journey, but there were sacrifices around us as a family, and he could be quite ruthless about it and say, come on, pack the bags, let's go.
With their children, Louise and Timothy, John and Valerie Olsen lived in the bush setting for 2 years.
We lived in a little mud brick house with no electricity and no bathroom because he needed to be in that landscape.
There was a lot of nudity, mad, wild parties on the weekend. You know, I lost my innocence in Dunmoochyn.
After Dunmoochyn, we moved back to Sydney, back to Watson's Bay.
A walk along the beach at Watson's Bay on Sydney Harbour for one of Australia's top painters. He's just received a major commission, the biggest challenge of his career.
All of that has to be rubbed down.
When John was about 44 years old, he was given probably the most important commission of his life to paint murals for the newly created Opera House.
You can hear nearly every ship in the harbour. All are joining in for this tremendous launching ceremony here.
John Olsen no doubt will explain to the Queen that he chose as the theme for the mural the late Kenneth Slessor's poem, 5 Bells, which is a lament for a friend drowned in Sydney Harbour.
Once the Opera House mural happened, all of a sudden there was more attention and more awareness around my dad and his work and the family.
Is it a matter of pride to you that 14 million people have seen this mural?
Oh, of course it is, and in all modesty, it's the best mural ever done in Australia.
My father, because he was the darling of Sydney, he was the darling of Australian art, he went down certain paths where he was impressionable.
You know, you get people ringing up saying, oh, John, can you open this art prize? Oh, John, can you, he was being pushed and pulled. And eventually he was down at an opening in Victoria and he met Nola Horth. And from there, he started a relationship.
At 52, John had found new inspiration with a young printmaker from Melbourne. They set up home and studio together in South Australia. He was painting more successfully than ever.
An artist is selfish, that he'll do anything to preserve his work and eliminate anyone who stands in his way. I don't really mean to hurt people either, but my act is only preservation.
When Dad left, suddenly all the lunches stopped. You know, there was always parties, lunches, and it was like the sun had disappeared.
You do what you have to do. And that is sometimes beyond the sense of ordinary morality.
I felt like I had to put my big girl shoes on very quickly at the age of 16 and pull it together for my mother because she was heartbroken at the time. And I remember going into cafes with her and she'd, cry and I think she had a bit of a nervous breakdown in some ways.
I think Louise dealt with it better than Tim dealt with it. It hit his core, that sense of suddenly not being that number one or not being thought of. Pretty difficult when we're having dinner at Kinsella's and Tony Bilson comes out and says, oh, I'm just back from Adelaide at your dad's wedding. And Tim and Louise just look at each other and he just married Nola in Adelaide.
Health, love, and money and enough time to enjoy all of it. Yeah.
Dad had sort of started up a new life with a new family. And we had long periods of very little communication at that time.
Nola wasn't welcoming, but Dad would still communicate with us. And then we went over and visited. He just wasn't as readily available as he was before.
I think you need to be a little thicker there, darling.
I think my father had to put his art first. Some may say, to be a great artist, you have to be a selfish bastard. Dad wasn't selfish. He had to do what he had to do.
Are you going to come down?
Yes, a couple of things I want to look at down there.
Everything was going very well until it didn't go well. When Nola Horth said, you've got to concentrate more on my career, John, now, because I'm an artist too, he said, well, good luck, Nola. I kiss your foot and I'll be on my way. And he walked out and never came back.
For 20 years, painter John Olsen has been making the journey to Lake Eyre.
Really gobsmacked with the sheer scale of it. And one can
looked at the horizon and the lake is still going. I mean, wow.
His method of drawing over the years became more and more natural, like a language, like speaking. It just flowed out of him. He's the painter of our continent. He's traversed it. He's been to the Pilbara, he's been to Northern Australia, been to Western Australia.
The thing about his work, it's heavily steeped in the sentiment of landscape, but yet joy, and so full of the love of life. When he moved back to Sydney from South Australia, it was a wonderful reunion. The sun had come back, the sun had risen again. But Dad had a huge fear of dying, feeling as though he wasn't loved. And it didn't take long for him to be swept off his feet by another woman.
Is this the theme you've been talking about?
Oh, yes. Yes, I've been thinking about this for several months now.
It was a very quick romance with Catherine Howard. I don't think they got to know each other too well before they got really involved. But, you know, off it went, into a new relationship, into a new landscape.
He now enjoys the country life on a grand estate in Sydney's Southern Highlands.
Catherine wasn't an artist. She, in fact, was in love with horses and collecting horses. John said, well, it's costing me a lot of money, but he was happy to see her happy and keep her happy.
Are you looking very beautiful?
Catherine was a very creative person. She was very elegant and she could decorate a house with style and panache.
Catherine took over pretty much the whole running of the business that was John Olsen, and it allowed him to just get in the studio.
He loved his family, but Tim and Louise felt that John always put his art first, before his marriage and before his children. And the trouble for Tim and Louise was that they really couldn't get an entree into the marriage with Catherine.
We would have loved to have had a loving relationship with Catherine, for her to have included us in her family, but it just wasn't to be. It was heartbreaking for Dad, too, that he wasn't able to really have his kids around.
Catherine was very protective of me. She should not have made it difficult for Tim and Louise to see me. I think that was very hurtful. And I'm really sorry about that.
When Dad met Catherine, I got my first job in a serious gallery, working with some of the most important artists of that day. I started my first gallery in the early 90s. I found a rightful place in the art world.
Art dealer Tim Olsen operates two of Australia's most successful art galleries, and this is Tim and wife Dominic's delightful living room.
The greatest artworks in this house.
Aren't they gorgeous?
I had everything that looked great from the outside. I did have a wonderful wife. I did have a beautiful child. I did have a wonderful business, but I couldn't see it.
Now, what about this? Isn't this fantastic? Yeah, I like that.
When Dad married women who wanted to, essentially extricate us from being around him, that was really when the drinking escalated. And it was getting to the point where I could no longer keep up the act. A couple of artists left the gallery. I was losing my family and I was about to lose my business. And that I was becoming a persona non grata. I was basically powerless over, alcohol and drugs and lots of things.
How does one become a man without whilst having a father who casts a great shadow?
I was extremely obese. I was pickled.
He ended up in hospital, and the nurses, I remember, saying to me, he's going to die. If we see him again, this could be it. But that was his rock bottom. And yeah, he packed himself off to America and went to Betty Ford.
I ended up spending 3 months there. I had to be rebuilt psychologically. I had to, in a way, be a nobody when no one had heard of John Olsen.
If nothing had been done by him, he would have died. Certainly lost the whole business and the life in the gutter. That's how serious it was. And I'm very proud of him.
He's resisted it now for 10 years, which is just, I'm just so proud of him. And I know just how much courage and how much strength it took him to reach the other side of his drinking addiction. I could have felt the burden of being John Olsen's daughter. At art school, I remember the art teacher looking over my shoulder, sort of saying, oh, yes, maybe a bit like her father, or, you know, there was always that comparison. That in so many ways, having a father like John Olsen has been so enriching. To me, I felt incredibly lucky to have had the love and interest that I have in art, and to have two parents also so passionately interested in that.
It's lovely, these touches of red against the blue, beautiful, discordant complementaries.
Louise, she was aware that she was famous vicariously because of her father, but she needed to do it on her own terms. And it's just alive. I mean, that is electric.
Yeah. Stephen and I met at art school, and towards our final year, we started Dinosaur Designs with Leanne Rossler, making jewellery and homewares.
You're painting ideas. Ideas are the most important thing about the work.
I felt that in the art world, everybody knew me, but in the design and fashion world, no one knew me or knew my family so much. So for me, it was kind of quite liberating, and our designs are all over the world now.
Hey, Rich.
I'm very proud of them because they are very creative people and began with nothing.
It's a good challenge, though. I like it.
And they have 100 employees. I mean, how did they learn to run that?
Louise is very stoic. She's strong, but, you know, she's coped with a lot of grief, I think. But that's the human experience. It's not unique to this family.
Hi, Mama. Got a lovely treat for you.
Really?
Yes. What's happening?
Lovely present from Dad.
How nice.
My mum, Valerie, just loved and adored my dad. And they ended up to be great friends, even through the breakup. I'd always see them have great chats, swapping books.
That's a big thing John and I had in common. We both love poetry.
She got on with her life, definitely, and she kept painting. She really found her own voice and her own strength. She was always there for us kids and always incredibly supportive. So to lose her in 2011 to a brain tumour was very heartbreaking.
And she was a perfect example of someone who went too soon. Whereas other people live their life to the fullest, commit sins, and they live forever.
Hey, senores, hey. Here we go, kid.
Dad and Catherine, they had a 27-year marriage, but in so many ways, I think the years with Catherine Howard was difficult because there's a lot of pressure and a lot of strain on Dad.
Turn it down a bit, Tim.
Catherine was fair-skinned, and she discovered she had a melanoma.
Look at that for colour.
She had a skin cancer that metastasised and grew into a brain tumour, and she passed away in 2016. Dad did everything possible to try and save her.
Where did we found it, Louise?
Just a moment, I've got to solve a culinary problem.
Oh, that's coming along beautifully.
Yes, it needs a drink of red wine.
Drink of red wine?
No, I don't want it to be alcoholic.
No. It's the only time I ever get to tip a bottle.
We were now able to be back in our dad's life again. It's like the doors opened again for us.
Ta-da!
Dad is 93 now, and we've had, you know, the last 5 or 6 years together.
Salud. Pesetas.
To art.
Amor. E bastante tempo para gastar.
Family, food, art and nature.
Dad says, oh, gosh, I love and missed you guys so much. And he realises just how much he had to sacrifice.
Just start getting legs.
They love to come here. Louise has a studio. Tim cooks with me. So it's open house for them. Someone said to me, can't you talk about anything but art? And I said, but what else is there to talk about?
Well, it's always been top topic in our house, hasn't it? Yeah. Always.
There's no lingering resentments. All the amends have been made. And we just enjoy this time because we don't know how long it'll last.
And we need another break. You don't just retire. It's not in my vocabulary. I enjoy the studio, which is really an artist chapel, and I like to pray here every day.
I'm going to try this, John.
Yeah.
So the last few days of his life, he was painting in the studio, and he had 4 paintings going, and he'd just finished the last one. He started shaking, and he had a mild stroke. And he said, I just need to sleep. I just need to go to bed.
As usual, we were here that weekend, as we were most weekends. And he looked at Louise and I and said, I think this is the end. Before he went into an unconscious state, I apologised to him for perhaps not fulfilling his wishes of what he expected of me. And at the same time, I said, Dad, I forgive you too. We played beautiful music and lit candles. We held his hand, and the birds were making their final noise of the day. The ducks were flapping, and he just passed.
On behalf of John's family, I welcome you here today to pay tribute to him and his profound presence in our lives.
This is the day I've feared all my life, and it's here. And it is a celebration. It's to praise a man who did nothing but praise everything he saw and everything he felt. To be given a service surrounded by your own art, your closest friends and your family was such a wonderful way to say goodbye.
Being one of his final students in his art school of life was something I'll never forget.
I'd so often be at a funeral with Dad and he'd stand up and say, let's 3 cheers for a wonderful life. And that's how I think he'd be feeling. Celebrate my wonderful life. See how beautiful the light is in here in the afternoons? When you go into his studio, you feel him, because that's where his life force was. Smell of acrylic. Is that the oil or acrylic, that one?
Smell of creativity.
Yeah. There's this incredible sense of wonder and adventure and endless possibilities.
This really was his little chapel.
Yeah.
He'd stand here in front of the canvas at the end of the hairy stick and weave and, move his wand.
Yes. Love taking the line for a walk.
The paint still smells fresh. The brushes are left exactly where he laid them down for the last time. And because he often didn't know where it all came from.
No.
It just happened. But I feel extremely liberated to get on with my life. What the Olsen life means, it's a life to do with truth, joy, celebration, melancholy, regret, gratitude, all the things that encompass a full and expansive life. So I'm grateful for every aspect about him, because it's part of what's made me. That Olsen thing is living through Louise and me now.